My name is Tracy Phillips, and I'm Technical Officer with the ACE facility at the CBF. Thank you for joining us for our Extender Producer Responsibility webinar. We're looking forward to learning with you. This is part of our capacity building series, and we're glad that you're here with us. I'm going to turn over to our CEO, Ms. Karen McDonald-Gay, to give us our welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and I am very, very pleased to be with you here today, online at least. The discussion today is CBF's presentation on Extender Producer Responsibility. And I know about the CBF part. I don't know about the EPR part. So I'm going to leave that to the experts, but I'm very pleased to let you know a little bit about what the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund does. We are an umbrella environmental fund that seeks to figure out and work with ideas for sustainable financing in the Caribbean region, specifically in our areas of focus, which are on conservation, biodiversity conservation, climate change in the area of ecosystem-based adaptation, and circular economy ideas, which is the latest program. And I'm very pleased that Rachel Ramsey, who is our program manager, and her team has been able to really get a strong foothold and foundation onto what's happening in the region in terms of circular economy and some of the ideas that we need to flesh out more and hear more about in the region. And this is one of those ideas. I was very lucky to have gone with Rachel to Busan, South Korea, for some of the discussions on plastics and the plastics treaty, which we know has a lot more work to go, but it was very fascinating and quite a learning experience for me to understand all that needs to happen. And specifically in the area of EPR, really, I think some of the questions we want to think about, as I always ask in our discussions, is how do we Caribbeanize it? Is it Caribbeanizable? That's not a word, I'm making it up. But how do we make sure that what we're doing is going to be useful and relevant and the best fit for the Caribbean region? So I look forward to the discussion with that kind of lens in mind. And with that, I'm happy to hand back over to the real experts and the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And for our opening remarks, we're going to our chair of the ACE Facility Committee, Mr. Derek Lupat.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Karen. And a good afternoon and warm welcome to the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund's webinar on extended producer responsibility. Before I give my very brief remarks, I would like to recognize a few persons and entities, starting with Sophie Vargas Cardenas and the team at GIZ for providing the funding for these capacity building and training sessions. Thank you very much. Black Forest Solutions Consultants, who are the facilitators. Of course, our very important CBF board members, our important CBF CEO, Karen McDonald-Gale, as well as the entire of the CBF and ACE team, as well as our fellow ACE committee members. So afternoon again, my name is Derek Lupat. I'm a certified circular economy specialist, and I'm the chairman of CBF's Advancing Circular Economy, or ACE, facility committee. So as Karen would have said, and this is going back as far as 2012, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has been working to ensure continuous funding for conservation and sustainable development in the Caribbean. As a regional umbrella environmental fund that uses a flexible structure to implement innovative solutions and consolidate resource mobilization through a range of financial instruments. Of its 3 programs, which Karen would have mentioned, its most recent is the Nature-Based Economies Program. And that is developed around the Advancing Circular Economy, or ACE facility, which is funded by KFW on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. The objective of the ACE facility is to contribute to the reduction of marine litter in the insular Caribbean through the advancement of circular economy projects. While the attention on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and justice recycling and cleanups are appreciated and needed, I am an advocate for a root cause-based approach, and it is increasingly evident that the present-day linear economy is not ideal at achieving the much-needed balance of economic development, social good, and ecological preservation. I applaud the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund for recognizing the importance and value of addressing the root causes of marine pollution, given that a recent study revealed that approximately 90% of marine pollution originated from land-based activities, hence the emergence of the ACE facility. Further, it is encouraging that CBF has seen it fit to hold this webinar on EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, which is one of the key policy approaches being advocated in the developed world as part of the global transition to a more circular economy. As many of you would know, the ACE facility had its first call for proposal in late 2024, and with the second round coming up in August 2025, the team felt it fit to bolster the technical understanding of policy approaches such as EPR in the region, as we are keen to see projects designed considering these types of strategies. According to the OECD, an extended producer responsibility, and I'm not going to do the presentation, I'm just touching on the basics, is an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for a product is extended to the post-consumer stage of a product's life cycle. EPR schemes support eco-design for the repair and recycling of products placed on the market by modulating financial contributions paid by producers to foster improved waste management activities in order to achieve increasingly higher quality recycled materials. However, as with many of these things, potential risks are inherent, and they include misinformed and misled policies, lack of enforcement, and lack of requisite transparency, accountability, and monitoring. I'm hoping that during the discussion today, we would be able to get some insight and a way forward on some of these challenges and learn from the developed countries who have already started to advance EPR in their regions. So in closing, I look forward to your active engagement in this very important and interesting CBF webinar. As small island development states, our vulnerability to external economic, social, and environmental shocks is high, and the CBF is proud to continue its work to bring the region together to learn, collaborate, and problem solve. I wish you all a very engaging webinar. Thank you.
Okay, and just some housekeeping before we move on and get fully into the session. We do have translators, so if you're a French speaker or a Spanish speaker, if I have the screen up on how you can access the translations, and just in the chat, just type and let us know if you're having any issues. And then I will basically be handing over to our team from Black Forest Solutions Consultancy, Rodrigo and Noreen, and they will be taking us through this training session. All right. Again, if there are any questions, you can always type in the chat. We are monitoring the chat, so we'll be able to address any. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Rodrigo, just confirm I will jump right in, yes?
Yeah. Go ahead, Neri. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the introduction, Tracy and Derek. So the participants should be seeing my screen now with the ominous forest. All right. And yeah, there will actually be, I think we've scheduled a few very short Q&A breaks. So I think in those, we can maybe go through the questions in the chat or also verbally. And yes, then I will jump right in, and I think I can pick up well from your introduction, Derek. So just to myself, I'm Naren Jones, Consulting Project Manager at Black Forest Solutions and Managing Director of our sister company, Green Forest Solutions, which is only EPR focused, where we provide EPR compliance services for waste plastic packaging, waste electrical and electronic equipment, waste batteries, and waste textiles in emerging markets globally. And to the group, so we are a group of companies under the Rainbow Forest group. And what you see to the right here is the actual EPR or the EPR ventures with which to date we've managed just about more than 35,000 tons of different waste streams. And to the group in the past around about 9 years, we've completed more than 250 projects in 65 countries globally and have grown to a team of 30 members with different offices globally, providing waste management consultancy, but also waste management operations, for example, through transfrontier shipment of hazardous waste and, of course, extended producer responsibility compliance services. And with that, without further ado, I jump right into the topic of EPR and how EPR can support the sustainable transition to a circular economy, also in the Caribbean region and in small island developing states. Just a quick confirmation, Rodrigo, I'm well audible, I hope.
Yeah. No problem. Go ahead with that.
Perfect. So extended producer responsibility, as it was already introduced in the beginning, there's a very famous definition by the OECD as an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for a product is then extended to the post-consumer stage of this product's life cycle. Now, importantly to note, what is a producer actually? So a producer is not necessarily just the physical manufacturer of the product, but it could also be an importer of the product or a distributor potentially of the product locally. So not necessarily just the company actually creating the product. And yeah, in effect, the financial responsibility of waste management, once these products reach the end of their life, is shifted to this producer or importer of the product. And one of the main purposes of this shall not just be to finance waste management and recycling, but also to incentivize producers to use less harmful substances in their products, because of course they will have to pay for the eventual recycling and waste management. And what you see to the right here is the term PRO, which stands for Producer Responsibility Organization. And this is an organization that assumes the responsibility of producers and often in a collective scheme for multiple producers and implements these waste management services. Because of course, let's say a bottling company for beverages is a bottling company, not necessarily experienced in waste management. So they wouldn't be implementing these services by themselves, but rather contracting such a PRO to implement it for their sake. Now, what does extended responsibility actually mean? So if you see here, this is sort of the traditional lifespan of a product, where you find, of course, design, production, the sales of the product, and potentially after sales, the way the consumer holds the product is considered the traditional responsibility. But extended simply means to extend it to the time when this product becomes waste, when the bottle is drunk, when the packet of chips is eaten, or when the phone or the laptop breaks, for example. So what happens in that case? How is it collected? How is the waste sorted? How is it treated? And how are these resources reintroduced in the circular economy? What impact does EPR bring actually to a country? And there are, of course, these pest domains that are mainly considered. So the economic impact is it increases the budget for waste management and shift some of this responsibility from the public budget from the taxpayer money to actually the private sector. Environmentally, I guess it is obvious, lesser waste is actually ends up in the environment unmanaged. Less waste is landfill because it is recycled, because it is reintroduced. Socially, EPR has a very large potential for job creation. So the recycling sector, if you think of countries like Germany, it employs close to 200,000 people, and a lot of that is actually co-financed through extended producer responsibility. And lastly, technologically, EPR really incentivizes and drives innovation, both in the waste management and in recycling, but also in circular economy business models, more on the upstream side of bringing a product into the market. And yeah, these are four common domains to mention, and yeah. Rewinding to Germany in the 1990s, Germany is often mentioned as one of the EPR pioneers for the reason that probably one of the first EPR schemes was implemented in Germany for plastic packaging. And the EPR legislation was, for example, a WEEE, so an e-waste directive that mandated producers to take this responsibility for the products they placed on the market. But similarly, a plastic packaging directive was introduced in the European Union and adopted by Germany. And this led to the setup of producer responsibility organizations, which operationally, financially managed reverse chains, managed recycling systems. And through that, they were incrementally improved, and jobs were created until Germany can now boast one of the highest recycling rates globally. The consequences of EPR, as you can see here, primarily is, in the best case, there's no cost for citizens via the municipal waste fees. So for the products that are in scope, consumers, households should not be paying any fee for the collection from their household. And this should entirely be shifted to the producers. There shouldn't be cost for municipalities correspondingly, and there shouldn't be any cost for the user at the last point of disposal of this product. Now, as you can see at the bottom here, of course, in typical market dynamics and economic dynamics, if the producer or the importer of the product has to pay this fee, it would naturally be shifted into the product price. So you might find that the prices of products increase slightly, but as you will see later, the increase in the product price is so marginal that it is hardly, it's pretty much negligible, especially for plastic packaged products. Now, going into one case study of a small island developing state in the Caribbean region. So Barbados was actually one of the pioneers in the region, in the Caribbean region, because already in 1986, they published the Returnable Containers Act, and already had quite a few different products in scope. So beers, bottles and cans, soft drinks, so soda, bottles, juices, and alcoholic beverages. So these products, as well as the packaging that they were shipped to the consumer in, were taken into the scope. And as you can see in the middle here, what the definition is that it's a dealer or distributor has to put in place a system for the recycling of these beverage containers, and not necessarily have to do it themselves, but a system that could be provided by a third party. So that, in a sense, this third party is sort of a producer responsibility organization that I mentioned before, that can implement these services for the actual producer. And today in 2024, Barbados has launched a new action plan to end plastic pollution. Part of that are new reuse systems a better EPR framework, a more enforceable EPR framework, and importantly, a deposit return scheme, into which we will also go later in this presentation. Another incentive I mentioned, or an effect I mentioned in the beginning, is sustainable product design. So the financial incentive is clear, similar to an eco-tax, which would tax producers or importers for the products they bring into the market that might be environmentally harmful. The EPR fee should also incentivize that producers already in the very early stages of the product life cycle, which are design, which are manufacturing, are considering or designing products that are easier to recycle, use fewer resources, contain less harmful substances, so that in effect the waste management of the product becomes more affordable for them, and they will have to pay a lower EPR fee. Now, the cost of EPR that I mentioned and how you can see it is quite negligible for plastic packaging. In this case, for e-waste, it might be more visible in the product price, but this is an example of Kenya, where it was calculated that the introduction of EPR for plastic packaging will increase the price of this bread loaf by 0.01%, which is a very small fee. And oftentimes you'll find that for plastic packaging, simply because the decimal value is so small, it is not even possible to really show it in the product price itself. But opposed to that, what is the potential revenue of EPR? So this is an example from a different region from Indonesia, so Southeast Asia, where of the total budget that is needed for waste management of products in scope would be covered by EPR by up to 72%. So that is quite a large sum. And imagining there this public budget that could be spent on other public responsibilities, such as education, such as other infrastructure development. In SIDS, so small island developing states, opposed to that, there's quite a different economic impact, and this coming simply from the fact that coastal regions, but also island regions, often have quite a large part of the economy counting on the tourism sector. So here you can see actually this graph, which shows the share of the economy that builds on the tourism sector, which is quite high. And the consequence of waste pollution, plastic waste pollution in ocean areas, in corals, in beaches is can get so high that it gets so unattractive for tourists to visit the beaches, and these economic impacts can actually be measured and monetized. So a few facts before we soon go into a Q&A. So EPR, what will it do? It will improve the available budget for waste management. It is not a high burden on companies or consumers, which is a very common misconception. It will finance a large portion of waste management. It is, if it is well implemented, it is sustainable and self-financing. And in countries like, or in the small island developing states, there are increasing number of national policies and regulations, but currently the implementation and enforcement are still inadequate. And there's a lot of potential for improvement here, both on public and private sector levels. Here you can see actually how EPR has developed in the past more than 20 years. So where it really started in Germany and a few nations in Europe over time, it is now expanded globally. So we see more and more EPR policies being introduced, or EPR-like schemes being implemented, where of course some aren't necessarily very good and enforceable regulatory frameworks, but it just shows how there's a real trend for EPR. The concept is also spreading product-wise. Here's just one example of what you commonly find in Europe. So there's a lot of EPR for electronics. Packaging is a very big sector, of course, but it can also be implemented for tires, for batteries commonly, for waste cars. So there's a lot of potential, used cooking oil even. And yeah, oftentimes, or what can be done in a very optimal case is that there's sort of a high-level EPR regulatory framework that covers the general concept of producer responsibility and the polluter pays principle, and then different sub-regulations for the different waste streams can be plugged into this high-level regulation, as you could say. In the Latin American countries also, you can see it goes across product, across waste streams. Colombia really being a pioneer here, having implemented EPR for 6 different waste streams, but it is growing in the region. There are different EPR instruments, so extended producer responsibility mustn't just be one article in a waste management regulation, but there's a lot of different steps along the value chain of upstream value chain and downstream value chains of a product where an EPR or EPR like mechanism can be implemented and can be formalized in a regulation. And that takes us to our first little Q&A. I would kindly ask the moderators to support.
All right, so I see we have one hand raised. Joanne Norville, go ahead.
Thank you. Joanne Norville from the Department of Sustainable Development in St. Lucia. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was great and really put things into perspective. I'm sure it was very informative for most of the participants here. One thing I did wish I could see more of, or that may help, was the concept of what happens with the product, the waste, after for the producer that the producer is taking responsibility for. For example, in the case of plastic bottles, once the beverage has been consumed by the consumer, the waste left over is the empty plastic bottle. And for the producer to take responsibility for that, there would probably have to be some kind of equipment or system in place, which is something that a lot of our small island developing states do not have. It's not infrastructure or equipment that we have readily available. Very often, the only option is to export it to a facility like a recycling facility where these things can be properly managed and recycled. But that itself is a very high cost. So while I do appreciate that there is probably in an ideal scenario and in many of the developed countries, a system where they can apply a very small fee to the product so that it can be reasonably dealt with, considering they have the necessary facilities for processing and taking that responsibility. We do also want to consider that in our smaller and developing countries, it's a little more complex in that additional investment needs to be made. And that is, I guess it can be reasonably done and taken into consideration, but that would affect, of course, the cost that the producer has to apply, which may make it a little higher. And again, in small island developing states, any little thing like a 10% increase in the cost of the product.
Mire, le cerró la puerta, doña.
Sorry? Oh, yes, even a 10% or 5% increase in the cost of a product could affect the consumers and the producers. So just I guess it's a comment and observation that I didn't quite see that part, the lack of facilities and infrastructure taken into consideration in the EPR system. And is there any, I guess a question would be, is there any way that you can see to work around that absence of facilities, making it essentially a sink for the producer to take responsibility for the waste, because there's nothing they can gain from taking that responsibility at the end of the day, and all that happens is they increase the cost to consumers, to probably even the detriment of their business. So yeah, that's my comments and question. What can be done taking that into consideration? Thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much, Joanne, for the good question. And definitely that is a risk that is faced, and that is also a concern that is often raised, especially by the industry that would be eventually contributing these EPR fees, is what if the fee gets so high that we cannot afford, or it's not economical for us anymore to sell products to this specific market, like a small island developing state. Or if we are paying this EPR fee and we shift this into the product price, will the price get so high that let's say the local purchasing power can't really afford these products anymore? And that should of course not be the case, and it should not become a burden to the local industry, but also not to the local waste management industry, that administration of the EPR scheme becomes simply too expensive. And you don't find that is the case. So looking at now some nations that are in the early implementation days of EPR, so in India, it has been effectively about 2.5, 3 years now that there was a very good enforceable regulation. You find countries like South Africa, Brazil, but also more and more within Africa now, that EPR regulations are being introduced in regions where the waste management infrastructure has to date been not sufficient. When it comes to e-waste or batteries, that is much worse. But also for plastic packaging, you'll find that often valuable materials like PET, PP, HDPE, LDPE are collected by either local formal or informal waste collectors, but a lot of other packaging is left aside simply because the treatment of that material is not profitable at all. And in those regions, of course, there's insufficient infrastructure at the early implementation stage of EPR. But what EPR shall bring, and does bring if it is implemented well, is it brings finances into the market at first. And of course, finances won't get you far if there's no treatment facility, or there's no collection points, there's no material recovery facilities, there's intermediary points. So what an EPR scheme should aim for, and a producer responsibility organization should aim for in the beginning, is to use what is there and to manage the waste according to the EPR targets in the best environmentally sound manner that is locally available, and try to improve from there. So that suddenly through the stability, the market stability, and the money coming into the market that EPR brings, it could become suddenly attractive for an investor to say, okay, a private investor or maybe an international development bank, to set up a recycling facility because there is sufficient feedstock, so actual waste being collected and delivered to the facility, to make it profitable, because the investment will amortize over a few years. And through that, EPR, or the purpose of EPR also in the beginning, should not necessarily be to, let's say, make the deliver the perfect system. In the beginning, I brought examples like Germany, but Germany has been doing that for 20 years, and it took a very long time with a lot of mistakes along the way. And it's, but you shouldn't compare an early state EPR system to that. And a second thing is that the government can design the scheme in a good way. And that is through EPR targets. And we will actually go to that a bit later in the presentation. But there are 3 targets that you'll often find formalized in an EPR regulation or in a supportive guideline. And those are targets for collection, targets for recycling, and targets for recovery of waste. And there could also be, for example, targets for the use of minimum recycled content in new products that are being created, simply to even more boost or stabilize the recycling sector. And let's say a target could be in the first year, knowing that the local infrastructure availability is quite low. Only a certain volume of, let's say, PET bottles can actually be processed in the country. So the target in the beginning will only be 10-15% of what is actually brought into the market is being collected, is being sorted, is being treated, which is not environmentally optimal in the beginning, but it is what is possible, and it is good to start somewhere. And while the industry stabilizes, while infrastructure is being developed over time, the targets will be increased. So the government will have maybe an annual target review process by which they look at the achievements from the previous year and decide on a new target for the next year, maybe raise it by 5%, the collection rate, raise the recycling rate by a certain percentage. So those are 2, or one is more the general attractiveness of the recycling and waste management industry that EPR brings, and thereby improves or should improve the infrastructure. And the other is how the government can intervene to ensure that the industry is not overburdened, that that the EPR scheme doesn't become a burden once it is implemented, but actually goes, let's say, goes easy on the private sector and improves over time. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
We have a few questions that came in through the chat. So the first question is, why do the producers pay to a private PRO funded by themselves? Or, well, who do they pay to? Is it to a private PRO funded by themselves based on management volume or rate? And then the second question is, who would drive it? Would it be the public or the private sector driven initiative?
Yes, thank you. Also a good question. I'll also provide a few insights on that after this Q&A. But in general, there's no rule for how an optimal EPR scheme could look. If it's a private sector-led initiative, if it is led by the actual industry producing these products, or if it is led by the waste management sector, or in rare but certain cases, it is actually managed entirely by the government. And respectively, the EPR fees that are being paid by the producers are managed either privately or publicly, or in a public-private partnership. But what should always be a baseline is that there is quite strict monitoring and controlling by the government. So maybe without the government actually participating financially, at least the government should always be aware and at a good level of detail of where these funds are actually flowing into what step of the value chain, and if the targets are actually being achieved. But and that can, I think that's a global thing, maybe more so in certain developing nations where the trust in the government might still be a bit lower simply due to corruption scandals, due to inefficient use of public funds, that the industry might not really like the idea of just paying into another government budget, sort of like a tax, and not really knowing what's coming out on the other end. So there you'll find that the industry does really prefer to have a private sector-led organization, a producer responsibility organization, that they understand financially, understand operationally, and they can really know, okay, I produce this product, I'm willing to pay for my waste management, sure, but I do want to know who is managing it, where's the money going, and that's sort of some insights to that. And as I mentioned, we'll show a bit more about that later.
Okay, and then we have another question regarding the experiences from other SIDS in terms of the scale for our region, because usually this is where a lot of challenges coming. So any experiences with the SID situation?
Yes, from our side as the Black Forest Solutions Group and as Green Forest Solutions, there are some markets where we're currently piloting EPR schemes. So one good example might be Zanzibar, which is a semi-autonomously governed region of Tanzania. So it has its own local government, it has its own environmental management authority, and thereby it also has the authority to institute own regulations, especially when it comes to circular economy and waste management, because for mainland Tanzania, the management is quite different than for the island archipelago of Zanzibar. And for that region, we're actually currently developing an EPR system to manage waste plastic packaging and a few other waste streams. And if there's interest, we are happy to share some more information, maybe following this webinar.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Just double checking.
Oh, and of course, we will also show a few case studies from actual Caribbean states and islands in that. So that will come in this presentation now.
Okay, so that's it for now.
Okay, then I shall proceed. And there will be more Q&As following this. So getting a bit more into operationalization. So who is actually involved in EPR? And there's a lot of things mentioned here. And that is what, for me personally, makes EPR also one of the most interesting regulatory frameworks and business models, because there are a lot of different stakeholders implicated and involved in EPR. So what you see in the middle, or more to the center, are actually entities that are physically, you could say, involved in either the upstream processes, so the manufacturing and the placement of products onto the market, as well as the downstream industry. So once the product becomes waste, once it is a post-consumer product, how is it collected, recycled, treated? And of course, all of these are different entities along the value chain with their own business models and with their own financial implications from EPR, operational implications from EPR, administrative implications from EPR. But there could also be more secondary and tertiary stakeholders. So one interesting one is our retailers, actually. So retailers, think of a supermarket or think of an electronics store that might not be a producer of the product, because they don't actually import the product into the market. They don't pay customs for this product, but they offer it in their stores to the consumer. And the importer who sells it to this retailer might be paying the EPR fee, But the retailer, of course, is operationally involved. And what you'll often find is that an EPR regulation also hands a certain responsibility to the retailer. That mustn't be financial, but it could be that the retailer is obligated to have a collection point in their store. So for bottle return in a DRS scheme, or electronics take back batteries, you'll often find battery boxes which are placed in retail stores, because of course batteries are quite hazardous if they're disposed from household waste. So that is a good example of a stakeholder who isn't immediately involved, but more on a secondary level. And of course, tertiary stakeholders, environmental NGOs who are involved, policymakers who receive the reporting and control and oversee the system. So it is really a very interesting regulation and business model, and managing a producer responsibility organization really requires to have a strong network within the country to the public and private sector to consider everyone's needs, to consider everyone's pain points, and to be able to implement an EPR scheme that works and that is efficient. Now, looking into the benefits for these individual stakeholders. So for the government and municipalities, it is a clear, controllable framework. There are good definitions. Responsibilities should be in a good regulation, should be very clear. And most of the effort is outsourced to the private sector. So in the case that it is a private sector-led EPR scheme, of course, the funds are kept within the private sector, but also the management, the overseeing are left on the first stage within the private sector. And that really can relieve municipalities, it can relieve these public authorities from a lot of burden, financial burden, but also administrative burden for previous waste management systems, and giving space for a lot of other responsibilities that the public sector does have. Then many different waste fractions can be covered, as I mentioned in the beginning. It is a big job creation opportunity in the recycling sector, in the waste management sector. It is an infrastructure development opportunity. And what it brings, especially because it is a private sector-led system and the finances stay within the private sector, it is a good sign to the population that it is not another eco-tax. They don't see on the product that they are now paying additional fees for the bottle, for the drink they are buying, but because it is sort of undercover, you could nearly say. Personally, before having heard about EPR 3 years ago, having lived in Germany for 30 years, I have never ever heard about EPR, but it was there all the time. So this kind of a positive signal to civil society that waste is being collected. There are segregation schemes, there are collection schemes, recycling is becoming a topic, but it doesn't feel to the consumer like a new burden. Benefits for waste operators and recyclers. The market size for this sector really grows, because if there's a collection target that has to be achieved, if there's a recycling and recovery target that the producer responsibility organizations and the producers are mandated to achieve, of course, there's suddenly a big revenue stream coming in for firms which can actually implement this. So waste collection firms, recycling firms. And another important thing is that suddenly non-valuable fractions. So I spoke of PET, for example, in the beginning, which is quite a valuable material. It can be sold. Usually it can be sold well on international markets, and thereby also usually it is profitable to collect and to recycle. But there are other materials or material compositions like multi-layer packaging, you know, when you have paper, with aluminium, with plastics in one packaging, which are actually either completely impossible to recycle, or it's economically so senseless to try to recycle them that they are usually left aside, they are incinerated, they are landfilled. And through producers becoming responsible for this and having to pay into a system, recyclers who already are working in this domain might actually consider to develop new facilities for these previously non-valuable fractions. And yeah, capacity investment opportunity that kind of aligns with that. So the return on investment calculation is much easier, because if you have one target, you sort of know that within 1 year, 20% of the products that are put onto the market are being collected and recycled. It is quite easy for yourself to make financial forecasting as a waste manager, and to yeah, have a certain cash flow stability through EPR. Now, benefit for the producers, at first you might think that it's just a burden for them because they are obliged to pay, but there are especially looking at multinational corporations, or companies who put products into many different markets, who have their own ESG targets. You notice that EPR is becoming quite a trend also amongst them, and they actually welcome EPR being introduced in countries. It creates a level playing field. So if you are a large multinational corporation and you want to meet your own internal policies and ESG targets, and you're selling to a country, you know that everyone in this country will be obliged to pay the same fee for the products they put onto the market. And you know that the cost for managing the entire system will be shared amongst everyone. It is very level, it is transparent, and that is welcomed by many producers. Then there's the ability to reap rewards from your own product design. So as I mentioned, if you maybe at a quite lower cost, if you reduce the amount of packaging in your product, if you use less hard to recycle materials in your product design, it might become quite a cost that you're saving on the other end, because the waste management and the EPR fee correspondingly is quite a bit lower. Then more control over the design than with the tax. So also, as mentioned before, paying simply an eco tax will go into one public budget, and it is very hard for the industry to understand sometimes where are my taxes going into. Same for consumers, of course. So having such a private sector-led producer responsibility organization, so a company which you contract to implement this service, you have a lot more control over where your money is actually going. And aligning with that, with EPR, the fees that you pay as a producer should be secured for the actual purpose. So you should have a very transparent budget of this amount is being paid for collection, this amount for sorting, this amount for logistics, this amount for the treatment, and maybe a certain buffer or a certain amount that is being invested in education and awareness activities for civil society, so that households are more aware of waste disposal, waste segregation. And the producer responsibility organization should be able to provide a very transparent budget to its customers, to the producers, which they, again, welcome as opposed to an eco tax. Other benefits for producers, importers, brand owners, as they abbreviated here, are really these long-term cost and strategy benefits. We all know that environmental social governance is becoming very important. There's a lot of financial pressure, investor pressure, but also, let's say, marketing pressure from civil society, which is becoming increasingly aware about sustainability, about environmental sustainability. And implementing such schemes like EPR and really becoming regulatorily compliant in the country is I would say, a very easy and cost-efficient way of meeting a lot of those investor but also consumer expectations. And now specifically for small island developing states. So what can be benefits? Deposit return schemes are a very effective way to increase the waste collection rates, because consumers themselves are incentivized to collect or to pick up their own waste and drop it off at collection centers. Keeping, of course, touristic areas a lot cleaner than without such a scheme. Then there are economic benefits. Of course, it is revenue for the public budget, and in touristic areas where there's a lot of consumption, of course, waste management is a burden, and I think EPR would be quite a welcome revenue also to cover these expenses. Then the adoption and enforcement of regulations and restrictions that limit the import of less sustainable plastics and plastic products, which is interesting in small island developing states, because often you find that, let's say for electronics products, there's no or hardly any local manufacturing, so everything is imported into the country. And border control is quite different on an island as opposed to a landlocked region, where you can have a lot of informal market trade, illegal trade even happening across borders. And let's say completely banning single-use plastics on an island is much easier implemented and also much easier enforceable than in a landlocked region. Then implementation of EPR policies comes with communication and awareness raising and training. So the producer responsibility organization, financed by the producers, is mandated to implement these communication and awareness activities. And this is really beneficial to present the touristic region as also a sustainability leader within a greater region like the Caribbean. And yeah, that is sort of an incidental benefit that comes through EPR and the mandate to increase awareness, and hopefully effectively leading to more revenue from the tourism sector, as the environment, which is probably why tourists come for travels and for holidays, is much cleaner. Now, some issues, and that is what this webinar is introduced with, are that, EPR systems, if they are set up inefficiently from the start, it can be quite a long and tedious process to find improvement, because the industry, if it's not, if the regulation is ambiguous, if the appointed government authority is not able or knowledgeable to actually enforce it, the industry can become, let's say, disappointed and sort of stop participating, even though they might have been endorsing it from the start. And these are some issues that you find: a lack of global standards for EPR, or let's say global standards for small island developing states, a lack of transparency and reporting, insufficient tracking and auditing, no or bad enforcement by the government, eco-modulation and eco-design incentives that I mentioned might not be so apparent, because producers just consider paying a fee easier than actually working, let's say, on the source problem, the root cause. There can be a lot of export of waste happening, so that the waste is not actually reprocessed locally, and the value of the recyclates doesn't actually stay in the country, but it is exported to other countries because it seems easier and cheaper for the producer, but it disadvantages the recycling sector. Quite simply, inefficient collection and recycling systems. So there's especially a lack in collection systems. it becomes very hard for the PRO to achieve its targets. Economic barriers that even with EPR, the recycling of certain materials still remains too costly. And that is why, unfortunately, sometimes certain material categories are left out of the EPR regulation. And generally, administrative complexity. And there are a few more issues with young EPR systems. I'm not going to read through all of them, but of course you are invited to review the presentation afterwards. Now the biggest challenges for small island developing states. A lack of innovation, a lack of infrastructure to actually be able to implement the EPR services, and for the producer responsibility organization to achieve its targets. So that it might have to resort to landfilling, even though there is a recycling target in the country, because simply there's no sufficient recycling capacity available. A lack of financial resources to run and improve the waste management system, especially in the start. EPR itself will likely not be able to finance large treatment facilities. To be able to at least have a certain capacity for its implementation, especially capital expenditures, investments into infrastructure in the beginning might be needed, and the government, the private sector, international development organizations should look into such young EPR systems and see actually operationally where is capacity required, and where might it be supportive to make such investments. Then public institutions for statistics and resource management can be inefficient. So EPR really heavily relies on data, financial data, the data of the actual waste flows. So how much quantities are being taken from where to where, how much is being treated, at what quality is it being treated. So there's a lot of data that the producers, which are paying for the scheme, but also the government, of course, want to know, because otherwise there can be a risk of fraud, there can be a risk of false reporting to reduce costs. So for a good EPR system, there needs to be good data management by the government, but also by the producer responsibility organizations. And if that is not given, an EPR system can become a black box, I would say. And lastly, adequate governance, monitoring, and enforcement. So even though a regulation might be very good, might be perfect for the local circumstances, and even though the industry might be willing to participate, if the government cannot enforce producer participation, cannot control the system, cannot, for example, penalize non-compliance, because simply the capacity, human resources in the government are missing for this, that can also lead to false reporting. It can lead to a black box EPR scheme. So this knowledge, the know-how, the skills, and also the human resources in the government do need to be slowly built to align with the efficiency of the EPR scheme. So for that, we have here a set of 8 success factors that we are mentioning now. There are hundreds more, of course, standard operating procedures, things that should be implemented in a good way, but these are 8 very, very prominent, very important success factors for an EPR system to be effective. And one are setting smart targets. So as I mentioned in the earlier, is targets for collection, for recycling, for recovery. They should be, let's say, high enough to improve the existing situation, to also push the industry a bit towards capacity improvement, but At the same time, they shouldn't be so high that everyone gets demotivated, nobody is able to achieve its targets, everyone becomes non-compliant and gets penalties. That doesn't make sense, of course. So the targets have to be set really according to the local circumstances, and they have to be set in a very clever manner. Then very clear definition of roles and responsibilities. So who is the producer? How is the producer defined? How is an importer defined? How is a waste collection firm defined? What is a material recovery facility? What is recycling? All of these things need to be very clear and unambiguous, because otherwise there can be, again, fraud, non-compliance, actors avoiding their responsibilities. There should be a level playing field. So what could lead to industry opposition is if, let's say, one producer is more disadvantaged than another because maybe a large international bottling company is paying or is paying more for importing the products than a local bottling company, or there's a bit of data and transparency, or there can be higher fees for certain materials, even though the recycling is not actually so expensive. So there can be many ways that the playing field can become uneven, and certain actors feel disadvantaged and will start opposing the EPR implementation. Empowering and education of consumers. It is not just for the environmental purpose, but actually operationally and financially, this is quite important, because waste management starts with the consumer. If the waste is disposed of properly, if the waste is maybe segregated, so let's say plastic packaging is separated from other mixed waste, it is not contaminated, it becomes much easier to collect, to recycle, and correspondingly the system becomes much cheaper to manage, and the producers will pay a lower fee. So this education and empowering of consumers actually is a very, very critical operational factor to make an EPR system work. There should be simple and equitable rules. There should be effective enforcement by the government. This EPR scheme should promote research and development in circular economy, digitalization potentially, but of course also in waste management, smart waste management, recycling, to find ways of making the scheme more efficient. And generally education and engagement of the industry, and with that I mean the waste management industry, but also the producers on that side, so that they feel they are participating from the start, that they feel that they have a certain say into the system design, and also that they understand that some of these common misconceptions, like EPR will be so expensive that nobody can pay for it and we will all become bankrupt, that such misconceptions are really ruled out simply by doing very good education and public awareness, much like in today's webinar. So how does an EPR framework become instituted? These are a few steps that we have defined that we think are a good manner of doing so. Starting with the definition of obligated producers and the categories of, in this case, plastic packaging. So again, who is actually the producer? Who is obligated to pay these fees? And also what products are in scope? So for example, different polymer types for plastic, or maybe different product applications like food wrapping, like beverage bottles. So that should be very clearly defined and also fit the local circumstances. And when you look at small island developing states, you could consider maybe that the tourism industry, hotels, for example, are large importers of plastic packaged products. Could that be a consideration that they also carry a certain responsibility? Then the introduction of a registry. With registry, we mean an electronic registry, which is hosted by the government authority that is overseeing the system. So this should be, in the best case, a registry where the producers, so the obligated companies, register themselves, but also declare how much products they're actually putting onto the market. And this becomes the single source of truth. So in this system, in this public database, or not public database, with which I don't mean that everybody can see this information, because of course sales data can be quite confidential, but a publicly accessible database that producers can declare how much products they are putting onto the market, and that the government can use to monitor the system, and that the PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organization, interfaces to, that possibly recycling firms, waste management firms are also registered in, and there's a good data management framework behind it for the government to oversee. Then next step, a definition of the EPR governance structure and the PRO model. So we've spoken of a private sector-led scheme, of public-private partnerships. Who is actually sitting in the board of directors? Could it be that one of the producers is also participating in this PRO? Maybe not. So there's very many different ways that such an EPR scheme can be governed and fit the local circumstances. Then a definition of targets and obligations. These previously mentioned collection, recycling, recovery targets, maybe minimum recycled content targets, which I would say are kind of the point at which an EPR scheme really becomes effective, because if you don't know how much you're supposed to manage, it becomes difficult to motivate the industry. There should be a definition of a penalty and enforcement system. So enforcement could also be incentives, positive financial incentives, tax deductions for participating in an EPR scheme, maybe access to markets, but of course also penalties for non-compliance. So let's say a producer is unaware of their obligations, or actually actively avoiding their obligations and not registering to this public to the registry, or is declaring false quantities. They say that they're introducing much less products to the market than they actually are. There should be a penalty system for this, and this could be different kinds of penalties, usually financial penalties. And we've seen in EPR schemes globally that these penalties can become quite high, and correspondingly really a burden for the industry if they are non-compliant. And then right at the end, so let's say the actual launch of the EPR system would be the issuing of the legal framework that considers everything that you see here before, and a lot more, that is instituted from a certain period on, and from then on producers have to become compliant. Then how is this actually enforced? So I've spoken of government authorities before, but that is a broad term. So oftentimes there will be a ministry, an environmental ministry, that actually introduces this EPR regulation. So they outline the product scope, the producers that are obligated, the targets, etc., and write this into one comprehensive regulation that is being published. Now, that is really a case that you see globally in most of the EPR schemes that I know, EPR systems that I know of, is that the government authority is either existing and is appointed. So this could be an environmental authority that is appointed to actually oversee this EPR scheme, or maybe a new government authority is founded to monitor and control this EPR system. And then the PRO actually assumes the operational responsibility. So the PRO actually manages its supply chain of waste collectors, recyclers. The PRO receives the funds. The PRO communicates with the different stakeholders. The PRO educates the civil society through awareness campaigns. So the PRO is really the on-ground entity, I would say, that hosts the whole EPR scheme. To that one example from the Dominican Republic. So in 2020, a waste management regulation was introduced to outline the general management of waste in the country. And later, there was also an EPR framework introduced. So this covered the management of waste, electrical and electronic equipment, and defined obligations of producers, importers, other stakeholders in the system. And the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources actually itself monitors and controls the EPR management plan. But what is still missing in this EPR scheme is the actual definition of the PRO, meaning that currently the producer is obligated to manage these, manage its own compliance, but it can do this through an agent. But this agent can theoretically be anyone, any private company. So it is not well. There's not a good framework for the monitoring, for the reporting to the government, which makes it a bit difficult to actually ensure that these targets of the EPR framework are being achieved. When it comes to targets, as suggested before, there can be targets not just for, let's say, plastic packaging in general, but also these can be broken down into the different categories or polymer types. So let's say the recycling rate and the collection rate for PET is quite high, then already in the country before EPR, then maybe the target in the beginning can be much higher than it could be for certain flexible plastics or multi-layer plastics. So there can be these different targets that should be set in a very smart manner, and they can increase over time. So as the industry develops, as everybody becomes comfortable with EPR, these targets can increase and increase over time to, in the end, achieve quite high recycling rates. So in some advanced systems in Europe, moving to up to 70% on average. So, and that takes us to another Q&A. So opening the floor.
Thank you. As we prepare for our Q&A, just to encourage healthy lifestyles. If you've been sitting for a while, now is your time to stretch, stand up, get your neck rolls in as we await the questions. Taking questions, you can ask your questions, just raise your hand and let me know you want to ask a question, or you can send it via the chat. Don't see any coming in as yet. Oh, Joanne, that's a new hand? So Joanne has a question. You can go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I think the parts about setting the targets, smart targets, was also particularly helpful in understanding, because I guess we in St. Lucia, we're looking at setting up a system for management of beverage containers, which would feature deposit refund systems. So it was all very useful. I find the presentation is very useful in helping us to understand, what kinds of things to look out for, as much as we are doing a lot of preparation and we have partners assisting us in this venture. Do want to learn as much as possible and benefit from the experiences of others. So I really do appreciate the presentation and all the insights shared. And just one thing that came to mind, I wanted to kind of get a better idea, I don't know if you would mind expanding a little more on how to ensure a level playing field, so how to make sure that, or what kinds of things to look out for specifically to make sure that some companies are not disproportionately disadvantaged in the setting up of this kind of system. So I know it does seem and appear that some companies, distributors in St. Lucia, for example, with respect to plastic bottles, some of them are already making moves and taking steps and probably positioning themselves to take full advantage of the system once it's implemented. But is there something we can do or something we should look out for to ensure that we're not inadvertently creating a monopoly that benefits those companies that are more prepared, and maybe the more local and less prepared companies are, disadvantaged so much that perhaps they might go out of business. So is that something we should be looking out for, or something that we can consider putting into place? At this point, we're still drafting the bill and everything, but if there's anything we should take into consideration, we'd be happy to know what that means.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for the question. So, I mean, an uneven playing field, generally you want to avoid that. There might be one case where you do actually, consciously implement that. It would be through eco-modulation. So if you actually want to actively have certain product categories which are environmentally very harmful, you want to decentivize those, that they actually cross-subsidize the management of more environmentally more friendly, easier to recycle materials. So that could be the only case that you could consider where some producers might find it unfair, the ones that are using these environmentally more harmful materials. But generally, to avoid that and to create this level playing field, I think the easiest way is through the financing mechanism, or maybe you could call it the pricing mechanism of the EPR scheme. So the targets are, of course, transparent. They should be public and they should apply to anyone. They are a percentage of what you put onto the market. So it doesn't matter if you sell 100,000 tons of PET or only 1,000, you pay at that percentage. So that shouldn't disadvantage anyone disproportionately. But what you could consider is, how are these EPR fees distributed across different producers participating in one EPR scheme? And that should also be just according to their market share. So if you know the cost for collection and treatment of the waste, you know the cost of your overheads, of administration, of reporting, etc., etc., you have the cost of the entire EPR scheme. And how, let's say, producers shouldn't feel disadvantaged is if this is simply distributed according to each individual producer's market share. So the put on market of products, their sales volumes. And that, I think, is a very effective means of ensuring that no producer feels disadvantaged. And certain aspects of such a pricing mechanism, if we call it that, could also be introduced in the regulation, maybe not itself, but an EPR guideline that is also published by the government, which kind of enforces how PROs have to calculate their fees according to a certain mechanism. And if that is transparent, if that is publicized and every producer at least knows about it, that can already avoid this uneven playing field. What is hard to avoid is when it comes to granularity. Let's think of e-waste. You might have one phone that weighs the same amount, but it contains a certain material that, or more of a certain material that is a bit harder to recycle than another one. It might be administratively impossible for the PRO to charge very bespoke fees for every product that is sold to the market. And there definitely becomes a difficulty to not slightly disadvantage certain producers who might be using certain product designs and that they don't cross-subsidize maybe other devices which are easy to recycle. But with granularity, it gets difficult, but I think with highest transparency of targets of the pricing mechanism, a lot can be mitigated there. And if you're interested in pricing mechanisms, of course, we can also provide some information, maybe in a follow-up conversation.
Okay.
Yes, that would be great. And thanks so much for the advice.
We have a hand up from Jeffrey Perez, and then I'll go to the chat. Jeffrey, go ahead. You can unmute and go ahead. Okay, I think he typed it in the chat. How does EPR work with small businesses? And for small businesses, what would be a good, PRO?
Yeah, when it comes to small businesses, what you'll often find in a regulation, and I think that is advisable, is that participation is only above a certain threshold. So it would be good if every producer, everyone who introduces even one single product, like one single item to the market, has to at least register with this e-registry. But the actual enforcement or the payment of EPR fees might only start at a certain market share or a certain volume of products that are put onto the market, which shall kind of protect, especially in developing nations, shall protect the smaller industry, the more localized industry, for whom it might be difficult to pay additional EPR fees. And once a business grows and goes over this threshold, that is when the EPR enforcement starts. And yeah, for small businesses, PROs, in large EPR markets or in very competitive EPR markets, that means there can be many different PROs. You do find that there are bespoke PROs which can address the needs of smaller businesses, because especially in the reverse logistics, so the management of smaller quantities, maybe in more rural areas or more remote areas, or the management of very specific products that aren't even sold by the large multinational corporations, the PRO might have to provide quite different services than it would provide to a very large firm, and that can definitely make sense to have individualized EPR schemes, up to the point that actually there can be completely individual producer responsibilities. So if it is possible for you as a business, you could also take responsibility by yourself and actually manage the collection of your own products and the treatment, maybe through a supply chain, through contractors, but to not actually participate in an EPR scheme, in a collective one at all, if the regulation allows that. I hope that answers the question.
All right. And then we have one more. How can EPR policies contribute to reducing waste in tourist-heavy areas, which often face challenges related to littering and waste disposal?
Yeah, so there, one concept that I personally always find interesting is to have actors in the tourism sector. So let's say hotels, public beaches, paid beaches, if that exists, to assign a certain responsibility to them. Or again, it mustn't be a financial responsibility, but similar to how a retailer could be treated, a hotel could be treated. So that according to the EPR regulation, a hotel is actually mandated to do certain education and awareness through posters, through their through their own emailing campaigns, through and also to provide for collection points for the tourists, so that it might be known that every hotel on an island is actually also a take-back point for plastic waste, plastic packaging waste. So I think that could be a very effective means of assigning this responsibility to one stakeholder that is really benefiting from and profiting from the tourism sector.
All right, I don't see any more questions at the moment. Yeah, don't see any more questions at the moment. You can go ahead.
All right. There should be a few more slides left. I hope we are still okay with the time. All right, then we touched upon it in the first Q&A. So the types of implementation models, and here I hope you can read these points. There are different ways, different governance models for such a producer responsibility organization, such an EPR scheme. So individual producer responsibility, quite simply, a company manages its compliance and its waste management of its post-consumer products by itself, or appoints maybe one agent to do it for, or there can be a collective scheme so that many producers get together in one scheme to leverage economies of scale, economies of scope, maybe even. There can be mandatory and voluntary schemes. Mandatory is quite simply there's a regulation, there are targets, it is enforced. And a voluntary scheme can be quite an effective mechanism towards the introduction of an EPR scheme or an EPR regulation to actually, before that is enforced, to get producers already participating in such a scheme, paying into the scheme on a voluntary basis and sort of starting the operations before the mandatory enforcement. It can be industry-led or government-led. Government-led, quite uncommon, but there are countries where the government actually wants to have full ownership also of the operations. These PROs can be for-profit or non-profit. So non-profit simply meaning that the PRO cannot pay out dividends to investors. The PRO does not generate any profits, but everything stays within the company and is reinvested into increasing the operations. And there can be monopoly EPR schemes, either natural, because one PRO was very strong, the market didn't allow for more PROs. Or it can also be an enforced monopoly that the government says there shall just be one single PRO to manage the scheme. Have advantages, also have disadvantages, and that really depends on the local circumstances. To the producer responsibility organization, here's a sort of a process flow chart that presents the data and the financial streams, but also the waste streams that the PRO is actually managing. Typical cost elements we touched upon are, of course, the waste management itself, collection, logistics, also collection equipment, which might be considered a capital expenditure, the sorting of waste and the recycling, the recovery, the disposal, as well as a lot of incidental cost elements, communication and awareness, but also everything that counts, for an organization. It is an organization or company like any other. So salaries, team, IT, equipment, insurances, everything needs to be covered. And that is also part of the cost of the EPR scheme, which these costs are then distributed across all of the participating producers. Here is a process flow. I hope that is a bit better to understand. So where the PRO actually stands in the scheme, reporting to the government authorities, taking the fees from the producers and distributing this according to the actual cost of the operations to all of the downstream, so the waste management actors. Then coming to the end, so a roadmap for small island developing states that we are proposing is in 12 steps from the EPR scheme creation of PROs to put that on the political agenda, to have a strong stakeholder engagement and communication plan, to gather feedback on how the EPR system should be shaped, but also to make aware of the upcoming obligations, to create a supervising authority or to appoint an existing supervising authority. Within that, to create working groups between public and private sector to speak about EPR, to design the scheme in a collaborative manner. Importantly, to have good data about the current market, the market capacity, the put on market. So to be really able to design a scheme and set targets that are applicable. Creation of a data collection system, so an electronic registry, but also maybe for the PRO, a data management framework, to understand the socio-economic impact of EPR and that it doesn't overburden the country actually, or that if it does, that it is designed in such a way that it doesn't, because that is always possible. Then actually to create the EPR policy itself and institute it, adopt it in the public sector, make aware the private sector, then start recording the data of economic, operational, environmental, and also social impact of this EPR scheme or the EPR system. And then the implementation of alternative programs to support the EPR, which can be other regulatory frameworks or policies such as minimum recycled content, such as hazardous waste management guidelines, general waste management guidelines, and then the implementation of evaluation and learning plans, maybe on a regular basis, so maybe an annual review process by which the EPR system can always still be adjusted and perfected for the local case. And to a close, this is an example of such a study that Black Forest Solutions has done in the case of Belize, the feasibility study on improving Belize's returnable containers system, where we were set to provide actionable recommendations that can actually lead to a more efficient and sustainable returnable container system in the country. And currently, it was limited to beverages, so carbonated soft drinks, beers, and other malt products, and beverage containers, respectively. But it didn't yet include, for example, a recovery target. There wasn't a published EPR policy, which also provides a foundation for this returnable container system. So there was a lot of work to do. And what was developed was, you could kind of say, nearly a mixed model of EPR and deposit refund. So deposit, or what you see to the left of this graphic, is more or less the traditional EPR scheme that you could think of, where the producers are also paying a normal fee for the management of the products they put on the market. But to the right, you see a prominent stakeholder, the retailers, and you can see the green arrow, which describes when the deposit. So the deposit that is paid at the point of introduction to the market and consumption is actually also going from one stakeholder to the other to be able to cover the expenses and to incentivize that these beverage bottles are really taken back to a collection point and back into the circular economy loop. So this is the kind of hybrid model that was proposed for Belize. And it was further adjusted to include more materials in scope, to include more beverage types, which were not previously in scope, and to actually define a specific deposit for the country that is fitting to the local circumstances and should not overburden the industry. And as a last conclusion, so how EPR improves municipal waste management. One is to the right, it diverts waste from landfills because the finance is there to actually collect, sort, and appropriately treat waste, improving the environmental conditions, making the tourism sector more attractive. And at the same time, it brings stability into the market, it brings feedstock into the market, and thereby makes investments in more infrastructure and better infrastructure for waste management attractive to improve the local municipal waste management status. And with that, thank you very much for your participation and listening in. I hope we didn't exceed the timeline very much.
No, you're right on time.
Wonderful.
So we're good to go. I guess I will open the floor for any other additional questions at this point. And then I believe I hand over to Rodrigo. So if there are any other additional questions anybody has, you can raise your hand or we can check the chat just to see if there are any other additional questions. I don't see any coming in on the chat. Let me just cross-check on hands raised. If not, I will hand over back to Rodrigo. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you all for your presence and CBF for the opportunity to share our knowledge related to EPR and schemes and the implementation on these kind of systems. With these kind of projects, we are hoping that these kind of activities and projects will be executed more in this part of the world, because we have some case studies and success cases in Europe, in the Southeast of Asia and these kind of countries. So we need to improve our situation here in the Caribbean zone and in Latin America in general. So the idea is to put the first seed to implement these kind of systems. So thank you very much again. And I will share with you a link in the chat for a new survey. At the beginning of the training, you received a link for a pre-survey, so we can evaluate the knowledge before the training related to EPR. So now we want to evaluate the impact of the training in the audience. So it will be great if you can help us to answer the survey and give us your feedback related to the training, the content, and the knowledge that you get from the training. So I will put this. Let me share my screen. Well, I will copy the link in the chat, and I will share this. So you can scan the QR and well answer the survey. Thank you very much, and well, Tracy, you get the word.
Yeah. It's also either scan the QR code or the link is in the chat as well. So they can click on the link and complete the survey. Let me just give people some time to do so. Also open to if anybody want to give their experience of this webinar. If there's anything you learned that was completely new, anything you're thinking of implementing in your own roles and organizations, open to get some feedback from our participants. The session was being recorded, so we will share the recording that we uploaded to the CBF's YouTube channel, and we will share the presentation with the participants, just in case you want to reference anything. So if I can have at least one participant to share with us how was the experience of this webinar. One bold person. Okay, so I see if some hands have been raised. So let's see. So is it Parley or Eddie? You can go ahead and speak.
Yes, thank you. I joined 10 minutes late, but I just wanted to say that at least all the material and content that I heard was quite interesting. I've been working in the Dominican Republic with the development of the new EPR regulation. So it's been interesting to know other experiences from other developing countries. As you said, and as it was mentioned, as a small island developing state, we're facing a lot of issues when thinking about EPR systems, as developed country has done it before. So for us, it's quite of a real challenge to really overcome many of the barriers that we have for this mechanism, but also a lot of opportunities for us to really connect the dots between the different economic sectors. So just wanted to say that in general, and that the experience was quite interesting as well as the content. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being our brave first person. And I see Wayne Neal, he has his hand raised. So you can go ahead, Wayne. You can just unmute and go right ahead, or you can type in the chat. Either way, I'll read. Oh, go ahead.
I may?
Yes, go ahead, go ahead. We
Yeah.
can hear you.
Okay, good. No, I just wanted to say that, well, the information was very useful, very insightful. What I was happy to hear is the mention of waste management, recycling, and waste management, because that is fundamentally the nature of what it is that we do. So our focus is really to fortify, build up, and scale our integrated solid waste management system, which in essence is the type of system that's needed in order for these waste streams to feed into an existing value chain that could make an EPR initiative successful. And one of the presenters was speaking regarding on the front end, it's a little disjointed. It's not going to work very smoothly. You have to work out the little kinks. All true, but if you have a value chain with a 10-year track record, then even the hiccups that you would experience would be lessened just based on the experience of being able to navigate the waste streams and having the capacity to process for export, those waste streams. So, the information was encouraging.
Thank you very much for sharing. All right. Do I see any? Lots of thank yous in the chat. Don't see any more hands. So with that, this essentially brings us to the end of our session. And we at the CBF, we want to thank you for being here, for participating, and for your interest in the subject area. We also want to say, again, special thanks to Sophie and the team at GIZ for essentially providing us with the resources to be able to have these capacity building sessions. Thank you to our two consultants from Black Forest for sharing your knowledge with us, being open to questions, and enlightening us more on our EPR knowledge. To our chair for the ACE facility, thank you for your very warm and opening remarks and encouragement. Also to our CEO, Karen, thank you again for always supporting and being on board, for your welcome remarks. Thank you to our I saw a few other ACE committee members on the session, so thank you for supporting. And as always, our wider CBF team, thank you for supporting this initiative. So with that, we do wish you a good afternoon, and you look out to continue capacity development sessions from the CBF on various topics. Thanks again. Have a great evening.